So my name is Fié. I am working for Social Innovation Exchange as a project manager on this project. So having a sort of very macro sort of overview of social innovation from a very global perspective, and working very much with the European angle right now, but also outside of my life at SIX, I am an interdisciplinary artist, socially engaged artist, and INSEP was something that I started back in 2017 when I was just starting in this practice, and I realized there was a lot of things around engagement, ethics of engaging in public spaces with different communities. How do you work around vulnerabilities that I realized needed more of a sort of exchange between practitioners who are experienced in this field to be able to share learning and to grow together along the way. So INSEP really started this way. Over the years, as I was connecting to more and more people and the network expanded, I realized that it wasn't just socially engaged art that was doing this type of work, that there was a lot of crossovers with people doing this work through different media. So there were people in tech, people in social innovation or social entrepreneurship, even like on a policy level. And I realized that there was a lot that could be learned if there were more cross-sector sort of collaborations and connections. A lot of the kind of impact and change can be done in a much deeper way, and also have a much more immense sort of like potential for change. And as a way of trying to document all the different really interesting and brilliant works that everyone is doing, the different knowledge from different perspectives, and also just the different individual practitioners who are doing really interesting socially engaged work. I started a podcast called Onions Talk. It's kind of an audio directory really to document the sort of the expanse and diversity of the different projects that's happening on the ground. And also it's a way for me to share the social capital that I've built up through the network. Along the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to type in the chat. We'll get back to it during the Q&A. So I'm going to do a little introduction of what socially engaged arts is and provide some global case studies from very different perspectives to just kick us off so that we have a better sort of common understanding of what socially engaged arts is. So the Tate Modern defines socially engaged practice as something that is collaborative and often participatory. It involves people as the medium or material of the work. So the artist's aim is not necessarily, you know, what you're maybe used to in terms of, oh, it's a painting or it's a sculpture or it's an exhibition that I go somewhere to see. It kind of takes away the artist from that spotlight to really, how could we work with the community towards a common goal, raise awareness and encourage conversations around different issues. A lot of times, or sometimes, you know, it could improve their physical or psychological conditions. And the arts open up conversations in a way that I guess people come in without a sort of wall, because it's through different artistic interventions and methods. This is from Tamarack Institute, one of the reports that they came up with. And I thought it brilliantly sort of highlighted and summarized the sort of difference. It's, you know, the idea of like only artists are creative to actually know all people are creative, and how could artists work as facilitators to handhold that process so that people can be very much in touch with their creativity instead of a predefined process. It's an emergent process of really coming together, sensing from the community what wants to emerge, and what is the topic of engagement, and then working together to build something up. I'm sure many of you social innovators will see that similarity with the work that you do on the ground as well, engaging with community. It's very participatory in its process. And instead of viewing artists as independent producers, artists can also be creative thinkers, because that process of development of any project timeline would look very different if you have artists who are right there from the beginning at the planning table. So instead of thinking of artists as they are meant to come in to produce a certain specific outcome like a painting, it could have very different, the project outcomes could look very different and have a very interesting creative input if artists were there from the very beginning of that process. And instead of community as a recipient, how could the community come in as a contributor, and how could the artist create a space that is equal and to facilitate that kind of platform and space and synergy so that everyone could come in as an equal participant who has equal ownership of the project. I'm going to go through some examples from all over the world that I've collected through the network. Something that's really interesting in India is Rangbunmi Theatre's work. They're in Onions Talk Season 4, Episode 2, if you want to check it out in more details. They use different theater techniques to address social issues with different communities in India. So forum theater is a theater technique in which you play out different scenarios that the communities come in. So the participants who are participating in forum theater, they are called spect actors. So they're not just spectators, but they're also actors as well. And what happens is usually, right, if I have a theme around gender violence, I will ask from the spectators, like, was there an issue or a scenario that was very unpleasant for you that you want to address? And then, okay, what happened during that situation? Let's play out the scenario, and then the spectators come in and they play out the different roles from the aggressor to the victim and the bystander. And then we would pause the scene and we would analyze with the sort of community collective intelligence. So what is happening in this scene? How could any of the characters of the people within that scenario do things differently? And this is how you use a real life scenario and also the collective intelligence of the group to really come up with solutions, empowering solutions of how we could act differently in different complicated and difficult real life scenarios. And it's been very, very, very effective. This was invented by Augusto Boal, and it's been adopted worldwide, internationally, over many, many different countries. Playback theater, a similar kind of theater technique, and they use it in corporate inclusivity trainings to address ageism and sexism, and also working with youths and children to address harassment. I think the beauty of such technique is that it really touches on people's empathy, because theater is so much about storytelling, and you are going in and really experiencing in a way, in a curated sense, what someone else would go through, and allowing yourself to put yourself in someone else's shoes, quite literally as well. Like, you know, we're playing out what someone would experience, say like a man experiencing what a woman would in India being harassed on a bus. Yeah, so that is theater perspective. This was a cross-sector sustainability collaboration that I did through INSEP. It was a program that I came up with called Sustenarts, which brought together sustainable enterprises and arts. So there were artists who came in who were supposed to use community engagement techniques and processes to highlight the climate solutions that are available. I think a lot of the conversations that have been brought up in the arts was around like climate problems, but a lot of people kind of feel quite frustrated, you know, like we're talking a lot about problems, but where are the solutions? And a lot of the solutions need scaling, but then we don't know enough about them. So that was really where the project started. Two of the companies that I could highlight is, one was INSEP Protein Pals, our project, where I worked with two different organizations that were doing future of food experimentation, and also like a insect protein sort of a company. So we created like a cricket powder Christmas cook-off. It was a 3-4 months long project. So there was a series of different social media engagement and very curated sort of online sessions to bring people together, as it was also during COVID and it was difficult with physical sessions, but really slowly building in that community building and pairing people up in a way that they get to meet someone that they don't know of before. So what was interesting was that there were many different people from very different backgrounds, be it from NGO, sustainability sort of background, or just people who are working in HR and interested and wanting to do something about sustainability. So through this sort of cooking session, it wasn't just about getting people used to eating insects and putting it in their diet as a sort of protein-rich alternative to meat, but it was also about building up consciously sustainability advocate community that would continue this work even after this art project, to collaborate with each other. How tiny things can save our world. It was a biotech firm that used a lot of algae, yeast, and bacterial research to see how these elements could be used to protect our ecosystem, especially food ecosystem. And because it was so scientific and technical, the algae painting workshop that the artists brought in, along with inviting the researcher from the company, really gave people the opportunity to get to know their work in a much deeper level through painting as well as conversations and Q&A. Some of the social awareness through technology, this is based in Berlin School of Machines Making and Make-Believe. They work with really interesting artists, hackers, designers, and they're basically a school where the participants come in and maybe they're learning about drones, maybe they're learning about machine learning, but then through this learning process, they engage with different social and political topics and concepts, like using drones to understand the conflict of borders in that area that they are flying their drones and taking photos of the geography of the place. And at the end of these residencies, they would have this art exhibition where the students would also come up with something for it to be exhibited. So it's really using different techniques to engage on deeper issues. And something that was interesting was the Zero party that Rachel organizes to talk about daddy issues. So, you know, also going into trauma and talking about using this sort of community exchange spaces. This is around fashion sustainability and storytelling. So Benjamin Von Wall, he's an artist who does large-scale installations, and Fashion Revolution. Laura was working for Fashion Revolution as a director, and she engaged with Ben for this project where, you know, she realized fashion waste is a huge issue, especially in Southeast Asia. Yet there wasn't a sort of like effective enough media campaign for more people to know about it. And so this collaboration happened, and Ben's process is that he works a lot with local volunteers to create these large scale installations, and then he does the media and the publicity himself as well. And what happened was that they realized through this collaboration, this sort of exposure of this project and the ability to raise awareness, the numbers reached hundreds of thousands, if not like millions. So it was numbers that the NGO alone wouldn't be able to achieve. So these are some, you know, different examples of ways that you can work together. This is the one example that is based in London. I found it interesting as a case study because I think it would really challenge quite a lot of what people conventionally think of as art. So what happened is that there was this space that is right behind British Library, and it was a collaboration between Somerstown Community Association, Camden London Borough Council, Central St. Martin's, which is an art university, and developers land lease. So Central St. Martin's and the Community Association, they had this space where they could use and develop. So there was like a community garden, but the other space of it was like a maker space where there were tools that the university provided and different workshops, and also a resident artist that the university brought in. And community could come in and engage in the different workshops, activities, and also use the maker space to create things that they wanted. And their report was really interesting. It was talking about a shift away from goods dominant logic, where, you know, it's all about creating goods that could be sold, into a service dominant logic, where it's about facilitating value creation, not just to deliver a service. So then when you look at the process of engagement, it's about what is the value that can emerge out of a process of engaging with a community. And then their processes was very much around exchange, dialogue, empathy, and understanding, so that people can get to know each other across differences. And this is really at the heart of socially engaged arts. And this is a final sort of slide to sum it up. What everyone's probably quite familiar with design thinking, but what is the difference between design thinking and artistic thinking? This was a really great summary that I found from Andy Sontag. And it's, you know, for a design thinking perspective, it's very human-centered, because you're always designing for the user. And in a way, you know, it pleases people, it solves the problem, and it intervenes. But artistic thinking, on the other hand, is very experience-centered. So it brings out the depth of the human experience. So, you know, things like empathy, things like what you would experience in a forum theater, like what Rambuni Theater does. It exposes blind spots, because it's not always comfortable when you talk about social or political issues. And artistic experience helps to bring that out, and it inspires people to transform themselves. Because if you're working in that participatory method, it really puts the power. It's a very sort of soft and gentle way of facilitating and a process in which people can have a reflection point in time and space to think about how they can do things differently, and to work upon what their role in life means. So this is, in summary, there are lots of different resources that's on INSEP's website and Onions Talk podcast. If you want to learn more about it, please feel free to go and check it out. I'm going to pass it on to Madeleine to share about teaching artists through her network, ITAC.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Madeleine McGirk. I'm the Managing Director of the International Teaching Artist Collaborative. So my first slide will be the next one, but my details are there if you want to reach out afterwards. So ITAC is a worldwide network of artists, community artists, teaching artists, participatory artists. We have as many different job titles as there are languages in the world. So we have chosen teaching artist because it was the most used, but it's certainly not the only. So in the UK, we tend to say participatory artist. And what that means is everything Fié just said. It is not using arts training to create more artists, although that does tend to happen. Instead, it is using arts as a tool to create a specific goal or a specific shift that you would like to happen. So I like to be really emphatic that we are not putting on dance pieces and saying we've changed the world. You know, sometimes that can happen from a really good dance piece, but that's not what our sector is doing. We are meeting communities. We are usually grassroots level practitioners with a specific social goal in mind, or a specific system shift in mind, or addressing an issue, or creating community, or any number of worthwhile goals, and recognizing the intrinsic ability of the arts to engage people, to bring people into feeling like there's a sense of ownership, to co-creating and to collaborating on solutions. And unless you're going to stand and lecture someone, I think generally engagement means some kind of creative engagement, some kind of activity or collaboration. So that is our sector. That's what we tend to mean. There are a million definitions, and I've put links to much more eloquent people who lead our field there. So when you send these out afterwards, you can have a more thorough deep dive about those definitions. Next slide, Fié. Thank you. So this is my sort of tongue-in-cheek definition about how to change the world. And essentially what I get into is the intrinsic motivation of people versus the extrinsic motivation. And teaching artistry really tends to focus on identifying and facilitating and enhancing the intrinsic motivation of people. So what is it people care about? Where do they want to focus their energy? What is going to be productive and useful and helpful and healthy for them? And how can we facilitate experiences which lead them in that direction and which uplift that part of them? I think so often social changes are dictated by policies which focus on the extrinsic. So you will have money if you do this, or you'll be seen as successful if you do that. It's about other people and being successful or useful in other people's eyes. But what teaching artistry really does is come back to the intrinsic motivations of people and help facilitate experiences where those can happen and where those shifts and those growths and those developments of empathy can start to happen. Usually that means some kind of shift in perspective or mindset or deeper understanding of something. And that is what is done in those artistic moments, those artistic workshops. It's the deepening of the understanding. Next slide, Fié. So how can that be applied to really create change? One of the projects that we recently launched a year and a half ago now, it's in its second iteration, is ITAC Impact Climate. We commissioned 5 teaching artists in different parts of the world to undertake work with their community on a climate issue that they felt was important. And the goal was to shift behaviours and beliefs in relation to this issue, but more importantly, to work with the community leads to mobilise them towards action that felt relevant and useful. Another important aspect of teaching artistry done well is that it's usually community-led, or at least community informed. It's not our job to tell people how to feel or how to believe, but to really listen deeply about what communities need and help facilitate experiences and journeys that lead them into the feeling of ownership and mobilizing towards that goal. So this was our goal with these 4 or 5 projects, and they have since been turned into case studies, which will be published next week. Yikes. And they will be free and available online, and you can all deep dive those then. Here is the very short example of what some of them look like. I won't read all of this because you will get these afterwards. But one great example was Raz, who worked in the Philippines. We renewed his funding for this year because the outcomes were so phenomenal. He worked on a project called Unmasking Climate Injustices. And his community in the Philippines is right on the front line of climate change. It is very real, very immediate, and very right now for them. And so what Raz did was works with local community farmers, mostly women farmers, to understand the process, to learn about how they are managing the fields and doing all these things in the face of this uncertain climate. Then bring the community into those spaces to learn about how and why the climate is impacting those specific things that they all rely on. There's a huge amount of misinformation, he tells us, in the local communities. And so his goal was to directly connect the people doing the work and noticing the changes with the science and the understanding and with the community, and together start to advocate for better conditions, for better solutions from local governments. And he created all sorts of arts workshops together to build that community and that community of thinking. And then the mayor's office has now involved them in the next campaign to help make sure that the campaign for green and economic solutions are better understood in the community, that the word is spread and that the misinformation is not part of it. So already we're seeing the local community taking much more action and a much more central role in steering that ship and making sure that it is serving them properly and that they understand fully what the decisions being taken mean for them. A similar initiative took place in Australia called Chill the Heat, which you can read about back there. That's okay, Fié. I'm conscious of time, so I won't explain that one in detail. This is the one I wanted to really focus on today, though, because it has such a special place in my heart. It's called School of the Impossible, and it took place in Florianopolis, Brazil. And it was an immersive theatre experience for children aged 8 to 10. And the goal of this was to help young people understand about the climate realities, and to do that through fun, engaging, curious experiences. And so this bookshelf appears in this classroom one day, and the kids aren't sure why or what's going on. And they start to find clues all over the school. Odd things start to happen. And of course, there's a teaching artist working with the teacher to facilitate all of this. And the kids are then led on this journey to become secret agents and keepers of the land. And they go on field trips. It's very integrated with all the other subjects. There's maths, there's geography, there's everything. And they start to discover answers and questions about what the Earth used to look like, what it could look like next. And they start to communicate with a scientist from the future who tells them what it looks like and what needs to happen to avoid this or to get you here. And then at the very end, they become teachers for the day, and the local community is invited in, and they explain to the adults this learning journey that they've had. We have just now opened a new portal here in Scotland. So there are 2 schools here undertaking this work in partnership with Brazil. And the local school council in Brazil has now rolled it out to every primary school in their area because it was so effective at helping young people understand green issues, but also maths and science and art and all of these amazing other things. One thing we tend to be really rigorous about is impact. And how do we know we're having an impact? How do we know we're really making good on these big social goals that we claim to have? And so we use something called the Continuum of Impact, which is really a fantastic resource. And it helps, it's very teaching artist friendly because it maps the kinds of impacts we tend to care about, which is changes in knowledge, changes in discourse, and changes in attitude. And these are things that, of course, you can measure in the short term, but you also can start to see shifts happening in the longer term. It's very unusual for us to get the chance to, see them when they're 18 and say, are you still interested? So that part's really always quite difficult. But the shifts around communities and how they interact and how they talk and how they view things do tend to be quite immediate, and we can measure those. And so those are all in our case studies too. Next slide, Francini. So that has been like a whirlwind tour of what some of these projects look like in practice and how we're trying to deploy them for certain social goals. They will be published in much more detail on our website in about a week. And I would invite you all to be part of our conference, which is happening next month. We get together every 2 years. Our international sector gathers online and in one part of the world. 1st to 3rd of September will be in Oslo, but the few days before that, there will be a comprehensive online offering led by our hubs in different countries, so all across time zones. Please do think about signing up if you're interested and hearing from the artists themselves about their practice and the power of that. And I hope this was useful in informing the ways that teaching artistry, participatory arts can be applied to achieve social innovation and social impact goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Next, we have Interwoven Productions. Jojo, she'll give us examples from Exeter.
Wow, that's a bit of a hard act to follow, isn't it? Thank you so much, Madeleine. I'm Jojo Spinks from Interwoven Productions, CIC, and we're based here in the UK, down in the Southwest Peninsula. Yeah, we've struggled with what to call ourselves. We've variously called ourselves creative placemakers, socially engaged artists, participatory practitioners. And I don't think we've still got a good description, but we work on the street. We work with communities inside 6 separate neighborhoods. And I think the best I can say is that we bow into service. We bow into service to our communities, to the citizens. But I think we probably bow into service of the broader concept of connection. So we connect people to people and people to place. Thanks, Fié. Can you move on the slide? Wonderful. Yeah. So when you do that, when you let go of your role as the creative expert, as we've heard in the previous discussions, often it doesn't look like art at all, because you've given up the power of saying I'm the artist. But things do happen that are very beautiful. So here we have Kev. I think he's on the right on your screen, or is he on the left? Kev is a local resident on a local authority housing estate on the edge of a city, Exeter in Devon. And he's got this extraordinary wealth of knowledge and understanding, not only of his own estate, housing estate, but also of the surrounding landscape. And he volunteers to take his neighbours on walks. And yeah, and there are silences. And there are stoppage moments when people just stand in a place that's adjacent to their council estate, and they'd never stop to look at just how very beautiful that is. Yeah, so Walks with Kev is like a little phenomenon, local phenomenon that's happening, and and it's very beautiful. A new slide for you. So I can hear you thinking, well, you know, if Kev's doing that for himself, for his own community, and where's the art? Well, what are Interwoven doing? What are we bringing to the table? Well, what we bring is, you can see Kev here again. What we bring is support and governance, but much more importantly, we bring him company. So we use a methodology that we've termed quiet voice methodology. To bring together a group of people on a single street, people who love a single street. So this is a pod, what we call a pod. These are people who either live or have lived on in a particular place and have a love of it. And they've come together, like Kev, to share their love of this place and to find effective ways to reaching that invitation out to their neighbours. Next one there, Fié. And yeah, what they come up with is, we've got no control, but it's often very beautiful. This is another pod. They're sat around a table. They've decided a great way to open a conversation with their neighbours is to package up sunflower seeds, and they're going to drop them into every single house on their street with an invitation to come and get involved with them as they plan to celebrate their street. But I'm using this slide because there is an invisible person here. And that's the gist of my talk, is the art of the animateur. There's an individual who we work with who is brought into a wonderful hug and interwoven embrace. And they're a super volunteer, and they have a whole set of learning and mentoring support for at least 12 months while they facilitate this on the streets. So their role is to be invisible. Their role is to step back. Their role is to let Kev fly. Their role is to say, yeah, sunflowers are a wonderful idea. What do we need to help you support that? And that is the place champion, traditionally known as an animateur. So 60s, 70s, 80s on the continent, the animateur was known as someone who would, well, literally it means to breathe life into. So our place champions are animateurs. They do what is needful to allow communities, pods, to come together and reach out to their neighbours. And yeah, so we prize our place champions hugely. They're incredibly important to us. But the gist of this talk is to persuade you that that is a creative act in itself. So they may not be acting as artists in the traditional way that a participatory artist is workshopping with a community, but it is a creative act to know how to step back and to allow a community into their own power. Hey, next one then, thanks, Fié. So here's another lovely example here of a pod in action. So these residents, they said, well, one of the invitations that they extended on a longer project for this mini event was, let's get together at Christmas time, let's make lanterns and parade all the way up this ordinary suburban Edwardian street, and decorate the windows and sing as we go. But what's extraordinary about this picture is the individuals that you see in high vis are not formal volunteers. They're not interwoven staff. They're the neighbours. They're sharing this with their neighbours. So they're empowered individuals who have learned how to do the risk assessment, and they know how to keep their neighbours, so that everyone has a safe, happy and well event. But it's totally level. It's totally provided from one neighbour to another. And the person who's facilitated this is the place champion. Next one for you. And participatory art in the more traditional sense happens. We've got another lovely pod member here chatting to a child, because the pod in this instance, they commissioned an artist to go into the local school to create this beautiful heritage-inspired tiled plaque for the local school. And they arranged for its installation and had a lovely unveiling event. But they were in charge of that. They commissioned the artist to do that. We didn't come up with an idea to do it. They came up with the idea, they commissioned the artist, they did everything else. And the happening was empowering. And that's the last couple of slides. Thanks, Fié. Yeah, so very quickly then, what am I talking about? What am I talking about? I'm talking about citizen empowerment. I'm talking about what happens when the art of the animateur is successful. Here we have an early pod. Even so these some of these individuals that you've seen running the events that you've seen. Early on, lots of crossed arms, not terribly sure, are they? They're not, oh, I don't know. You've all seen, if you've done street engagement, what an early kind of meetup looks like. And there they are. And I want to move swiftly to the next one, because this is what they look like when they step into their power. And you can see they've let their animateur, their place champion, come front and center. So there's a little short person. Yes, it's me. I was their animateur on this thing. But they let me in at the last minute to share their joy. So these individuals would never have formed a bond as friends, an intergenerational group as it is. They're lifelong friends now. They know where the vulnerable people are on their street. So they kept disappearing from this fantastic street party that they created. I said, where are you going with plates of food, cake? Well, it's because they'd identified that Edith and Aggie later down the road couldn't make it. And so they've made such great local connections. They just get to disappearing with food to take the party to the people on the street who couldn't come. And that was all completely coming from them. But much more importantly for health and well-being in the future is they've made a social pact with each other, that they know who's DBS, they know how to buddy up to knock safely on their vulnerable neighbours' doors, and they're going to continue doing that. So they've become health and well-being ambassadors on the street. And this is just one pod that we have. So we have 6 neighbourhoods at any given time. There are 6 pods actively doing that. And then the next year we go on to the next street and we create another pod and another pod. So and each pod is around times 10 individuals. And so it's like a wave of community action for health and well-being. And that is the art of the animateur. I'll leave it there.
Wow, thank you, Jojo. Very beautiful presentation. I'm sure the work that Interval Productions have been doing for years would have been really, really impactful during COVID. Just the kind of relationships that have been built over the years and be able to support each other during a time like COVID. Last but not least, we have Clara to share with us her practice and experience in Scotland.
Thanks, Fié. Hi, everyone. My name is Clara Bloomfield. I am an award-winning freelance international theatre maker, director, lecturer, and socially engaged artist from Scotland. I specialise in creating socially, politically engaged performance and learning experiences in a range of contexts and settings. My work lies at the intersection of theatre and society. Immediative and responsive in nature, I explore the stories of every day and present work in both theatres and non-traditional spaces as a catalyst for social change. I'm a recognised Fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts and an Arts for Good Fellow for the Singapore International Foundation for my commitment to creating performance for social change. I'm also a lecturer at Edinburgh College on their acting and performance programmes and on the BA Honours Dance and Drama with Kingston University programme. Within this presentation, I'm going to share examples of my theatre-based social innovation processes as a means of social engagement through deconstructing my process and citing an example of my work. Next slide, please, Fié. Context. I believe that young people can save the world. I'm a kid of the 80s, and in the 80s, we saw films that saw young people be the heroes. The Goonies, It, Stand By Me, E.T., Back to the Future. And in the 90s, the white man became the central hero. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Mel Gibson, Bruce Willis. And between the early noughties and now, we see superheroes. In this slide, you may recognise a number of the 80s movies where young people were central to saving their world. You can also see me dressed as Robin Hood. By the age of 8, I already had a strong sense of social injustice. I was an activist and artist from a very young age. But what does this mean in reference to my practice? Well, I have a particular interest in creating work with, for, and by young people. Performance created by the individual's lived experience, and have also an interest in health and theatre. As a freelance theatre maker, and through my company Caledonian Theatre, I create small-scale touring theatre and creative experiences for, with, and by young people, because I continue to believe that young people can save the world. And through creating performance with this demographic, we can encourage a greater dialogue about what it is to be a young person in today's society through the exploration of self, place, and identity. I'm committed to the UN Convention of the Rights of a Child through activating young people's voices through a specific approach to creating theatre that is rooted in responding to the young people's lived experience of their world. Next slide, please, Fié. Through this presentation, I encourage you as social innovators and socially engaged artists to consider that when we talk of change, what do we really mean by this? Who is this change for? What is the purpose of this change? By whom is this change taking place and why? And who are the initiators of this change and why? For example, is it a funder-driven agenda? Is it a policy agenda? Or indeed, is it by the people themselves? I ask these questions because if we're not careful in our position of change makers, the work we can do can easily replicate the struggles that are prevalent in our society. So therefore, under the wrong conditions, we can reinforce rather than challenge the status quo. And at all costs, we must avoid becoming the naughty superhero, the saviour. For in doing this, we're removing people's autonomy. But instead, we must create the conditions for individuals to be their own agents of change, just like the Goonies. With that in mind, admittedly, I initially found creating this presentation a little challenging. I found it hard to do this without the presence of any former young participants. And I felt to some degree their lack of presence in this presentation reinforced this notion of hierarchy of power. So I could have been in a position to talk about these young people as the more knowledgeable adult, and it wasn't going to be a dialogue of shared experience with these young people to have this dialogue with you. So instead, I'll take the opportunity today to speak more in depth about my processes and cite a piece of work by young people. And to do this, I'm going to talk about my pillars of practice. The stories we tell ourselves, both positive and negative, are part of our core belief systems. They're stored in our subconscious and they're born through our family values, our wider cultural, religious and social systems. And through our younger years, these core beliefs begin to shape not only our view on the world, but our perceptions of ourselves and our identity. Unconscious to a point, these belief systems, both positive and negative, do have an effect on the way that we move through life. They can be seen and educated through the things we must do or should do. As a humanist facilitator, I approach my work through the lens of Carl Rogers' person-centred approach. I have a process-informed practice that is interested in using theatre and art as a conversation with the participant and the participant to the wider world. And in starting from a place of conversation, you create a space for the potential for shifts, a shift in mindset, a shift in perspectives. Theatre alone cannot change the world, but it can alter thinking, and such shifts can catalyse change through freeing people from their negative core beliefs about themselves and about others in relation to these shoulds and musts, etc. Next slide, please, Fié. The purpose of art is to unravel the world around us. And I wonder if, as social innovators and socially engaged artists, if we took the radical position of placing people at the heart of the decision-making process, it could drive a narrative from the participants' perspective of the world, an autobiographical position where the telling of their stories could activate their voices as a means of claiming and reclaiming their own narrative. Furthermore, could such a reclamation lead to a process of Maslow's self-actualization, enabling individuals to be their own agents of change and support their well-being? Within my practice, I predominantly work with people's autobiographies to enable insights into the relationship between experiences and structures of power, between identity and its formation and reformation. And that's a quote by D. Heading. To achieve this, I do this through the pillars of my creative practice, using the lived experiences of individuals to create theatre as a creative conversation, resulting in 1, empathy, for the individuals to explore their conscious and unconscious bias and to see the world from another person's perspective, both as a participant and as an audience member. 2, self-compassion. Individuals then explore their own core belief systems and explore in more detail who they are, their world, their position in it, and if they want to take action. 3, togetherness, working together. And together, these pillars can create the right environment for culture shifting through advanced empathy, which can result in a catalyst for social and personal change. So what does that look like in practice? Next slide, please. I live by the rule, I learn from you, you can learn from me, and we can learn from each other. And this is one of the 7 rules, golden rules for participation. Originally created in 2013 by the Children and Young People's Commissioner of Scotland, arguably it's applicable to all civic engagements. This highlights and reminds us that socially engaged artists and innovators that we're not the saviour. I strive to break down traditional hegemonic structures and aim for co-creation through the implementation of Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, and use this tool to assess who's in power and who holds the decision-making process. Therefore, it's my objective as a teaching artist or socially engaged artist to implement this approach into the environments by cultivating an environment where participants can engage at Run 6, partnership. Partnership and offers participants to negotiate and engage in trade-off with traditional power holders, and it cultivates autonomy and co-creation, both to wider participation experiences and post-life, post-project. By adopting this partnership model, Attitudes enhanced my person-centred approach to theatre making by enabling a greater sharing of content knowledge and sharing the values and attitudes of discoveries of other people's thoughts and experiences. And therefore, by tearing down this top-tier approach to learning facilitation, that you can learn from me, I can learn from you, and we can learn from each other. By not parachuting into communities, we start to place a mutual learning and respect core system and believing that people have the capacity to create their own change, but also acknowledge that they often just need the environment to unlock this potential and to have the place to flourish that exist out with these traditional hegemonic structures. Next slide, please. So this case study is from Call to Action, and I'll put in the link later how you can access this website. Call to Action was the first online cross-cultural reimagining of the living newspaper. This was a term used at the early part of the last century for a theatrical form presenting factual information on current events to a popular audience. In other words, it was a social reflection. Through our project, we aim to engage young people from Edinburgh College in Scotland and Teatre Imakaratra through Singapore to reimagine a new world post-pandemic through the development of digital and online techniques. 60 young people aged 17 plus from both countries created 2 digital editions of the living newspaper, focusing on the lived experiences of young people during and post-pandemic. Call to Action aimed to create a global discourse relating to youth identity and to dismantle and disrupt the hegemonic narratives that surround youth identity. The digital theatre project explored the complex relationships between young people, culture, and wider social politics that were related to them. Supported by the Singapore International Foundation, this new digital collaborative approach to applied theatre saw an international cohort of young people explore the power-laden relationships between themselves and society. Through the lens of social justice and global citizenship, these theatre students listened to a variety of international viewpoints and analysed their own experiences, debated ideas, and made mindful, ethical choices about how to rep their own and represent others' truths. Through reflection and deliberation, these participants critically considered what they considered to be a global audience, sharing their stories and what they wanted to leave the audience with. It's worth noting, though, that unlike here in the UK, that in Singapore, all creative works, theatre, literature, film, radio, etc., is censored by the government. And the only real free space to protest or engage in free speech is on the internet. So adopting this digital approach to our collaboration, it became a highly politicised approach to artistic engagement and freedom of expression for these young people. Through crossing of geographical borders, this 3-month project provided the arena for the participants to explore their relationship with the other person's experience of the world, resulting in digital theatrical pieces which led to acts of personal and social change. Through weekly workshops and online discussions, the 60-strong cohort of learners placed the value of the young person's lived experience at the heart of the process. And we used this online platform as a means for the individual to explore their personal agency and identity, to work together to create their digital editions of the living newspaper. Stories ranged from highlighting the work done in Scotland to end period poverty, with a call to action in Singapore for period products to be free at the point of access for women and individuals who menstruate, and explore the differences in laws and right in both countries for members of the LGBTQAI+ communities. And work in this area and with our two organisations of artivism is still ongoing. Our participants found that learning about other people's culture that they didn't know about and how they were so similar and so distant, and that they really enjoyed experiencing new cultures and having the opportunity to produce something topical, political, and rebellious to create a change. Call to action was an example of my pillars of practice. Through empathy, the participants explored their conscious and unconscious bias to see the world through another person's perspective. They developed self-compassion and these core belief systems and deconstructed these should, could, would, musts, and started to explore who they are, their world, and their position in it. We began a notion of collective togetherness, with participators working together to achieve social and personal change. And like I said, which is still ongoing through culture shifting. So in conclusion, to return where I started, as social innovators and socially engaged artists, I ask you to consider in the future, when you talk of change, what do you really mean by this? Who is this change for? What is its purpose? By whom is this change taking place for, and why? Who is the initiator of this? And what is an integral part of your process that can enable someone else to be the hero of their own story? From the words of Doc Brown from the classic 80s film Back to the Future, your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you'd like to keep in touch or make more connections, my information's on the screen now. Thank you very much for your time. It's appreciated.
Thank you, Clara, for our presentation. We've got quite a sort of range now in terms of what's been touched on, from art creating a pointed space for reflection and human connection to being like a critical agent for narrative shifts. Now let's get to the questions that you might have. If at any point you would like to unmute to talk, please feel free to do so as well. Just raise your hand so that we can know. I'm gonna go down the chat and see what's been there. Cool. If anyone's got a question that they'd like to share, also we would really appreciate.
Sorry, I was going to tell you the first one that I can see, which was with an interest in networked action, a question to all participants to name their favorite networks around today's theme that are not linked with a project, but more with trust and commitment of the participants. So that's the first one I can see in the chat. That was from Marcus, I think.
Does anyone want to take that?
Sorry, Rose, can you restate the question, please? I think I missed some of that.
Sorry, yeah. So it says, with an interest in networked action, a question to all participants is to name your favorite networks around today's theme that are not linked with a project, but more with trust and commitment of the participants. So I think the question is around, do you have particular networks that you like to use, or that you have favorite networks that you use in your different practices, your different areas of work?
I can probably come in on that, right? So obviously my favorite network is ITAC, because I spend all day every day trying to make it good. But beyond that, I would say we've recently started partnering with Community Arts Network. CAN is their abbreviation, and they are really phenomenal. They're well resourced, they're well organized, they're strategic. and they have different ways to engage depending on who you are and what your interest is. But one of my favorite things is they have a sort of matchmaking profile, you know, for professional matchmaking. So if you're an artist and you want to connect with an arts institution, or you want to connect with an activist or different people in different kinds of spaces, you create your profile and you can start to filter and see who's where. So that's a really, really great one. The other network I enjoy is the Teaching Artists Guild in the USA. Less relevant for today's theme, but they are a grassroots network run by and for teaching artists in the USA, and they have what's called an asset map. So similarly, you can like drop yourself in a little Google map as to where you are, what you do, what you're looking for, and you can start to filter, see who's around you, build your own community based on who else came to the table. And I think that's a really special thing that networks can do, is not be so top down, but provide the space and the facilities for the interested people to gather and do what they will. So I think for those reasons, I really like CAN and Teaching Artists Guild.
Cara, Georgia, do you have anything to add on?
Yeah, I know that Madeleine didn't want to talk about ITAC, but I really do. I've been a huge fan of ITAC and involved with ITAC for the best part of sort of 6 or 7 years now. And what Madeleine and her team, and actually most credit to Madeleine, because what she's achieved single-handedly up until sort of the past year or so has just been incredible, bringing this global community together to have these discussions. It doesn't make you feel so isolated, but it gives you the opportunity to learn from other people's practice. And sometimes you could feel that when you're in your own community, when you're in your own country, that you're actually just sharing and having the same conversation again and again and again. And what ITAC's incredible at is moving the conversation on. Yeah, we've had these discussions, but what action can we take? And placing funding initiatives that you could take these learnings back to your own community and absolutely work with the community to make that change. So if you haven't done so already, sign up for the newsletter, and if you can, get along to some of their events, because it certainly has changed my life. And meeting Madeleine is just an incredible resource, because she's a wonderful human being that will put you and partner you with people from across the globe. And in terms of other networks, I think we're also really guilty of always just talking to the same people. So coming here today is a huge thing, because it's just not talking to other artists. Talking to other people who are out with your frame of reference allows you just not to exist in an echo chamber. And when you don't exist in an echo chamber, you realize the privileged position that you've been in. And that's when the change happens. And that's when magic happens. So try to not just exist in your echo chamber, speak to people out with your frame of reference.
I have a couple that I can share. I guess like what I try to do with INSEP is very bottom up. So sharing a lot of practitioners' work, but also there are managers of networks in the podcast. So SIX, the organization I'm currently working for, is also a network, but more with the social innovation focus. In terms of Southeast Asia, there is Mekong Cultural Hub that is doing quite a lot of engagement work with Southeast Asian artists in the region, and also like social political arts engagement, activism issues, topics. So that's quite interesting. In the UK, there's also Com Arts Network, and previously PubLib. They tried to set up a website to basically document all the socially engaged practitioners work in the UK, which is a really ambitious work that they were trying to do. I think they're currently still on Facebook. And also, you know, like Sonia on the chat as well, Tamarack community, they've been doing quite a lot of really interesting work and very great resources, and also One Drop Foundation. One Drop Foundation kind of spun off from, what was the, Cirque du Soleil. It's a foundation by Cirque du Soleil, and they've been doing quite a lot of work around, say, water innovation in developing countries, and really interesting resources as well from there. So there are stuff, quite a lot of stuff around, and also many of them who have been working in their intersections of these different spaces and networks were also interviewed on my podcast. So you can also go to that for like further links and stuff. If anyone would like to, you know, show us your face and switch on your camera and ask a question in person, feel free to do so. This is really like the part that I'm looking forward to the most, which is the most interactive part. I hope the presentation wasn't too long. Does anyone else have any more questions?
There's through in the chat, so I'll just get to them one by one. So there's another question. The next one is about, I'd like to ask the presenters about their relationship with funding, how to get paid and how to fund.
It's a big question. Madeleine, do you want to go first since you are doing kind of both?
Sure. So it's sort of the eternal question, isn't it? And it's part of why our sector needs so much more advocacy and recognition, is it's not quite artist, it's not quite teacher, it's not quite social worker, it's like somewhere in the middle, and people feel funny about opening funds just for that. I have to say in Scotland we are quite lucky comparatively in the international landscape because of Creative Scotland, and they do recognise that as a sector, but I know lots of other arts councils don't, so that's my caveat. My answer to the question though is ITAC is funded by a foundation. We have foundation funding that goes for a few years and then we have to apply to renew. We identify other pots of funding through grant applications, through all those traditional ways to put the money back into teaching artists. So we don't charge, our network's completely free. All of our activities are totally free, apart from the conferences because they cost money to run. But everything we do for the 2 years in between is free. So for that to be the case, we have to identify other pots of money, other funds, and it's an ongoing effort. Constant fundraising by me, constant fundraising by my colleagues, by our board, everyone, to then be able to commission artists to undertake work. So the projects I mentioned were commissions that we give artists. There are 20 others I didn't mention, and you'll see them on the website from the slides. But yeah, our goal is to always find funds and then channel it back into the sector. So almost always it's either institutions giving money, like arts institutions, or foundations.
Giorgio, I wonder if you want to talk about interwoven productions and circular economy.
Yeah, and I think that was really important part of our evolution, was to move into new economies. Because it's really important for us, because here in England, certainly in the Southwest, I see Stuart here in the group, I think he'll agree that it's this kind of work is not well recognised and not well supported. So we had to find another way. Nobody was paying us any attention whatsoever. So we just had to find another way to do what we thought was important, to do it the way that we felt was important. And so we looked at circular economy, we looked at new economies, and we wondered, while we're empowering our neighbourhoods to take their own action, to identify their own change, as Clara so beautifully described, maybe we could empower them also to not fund it, but to facilitate it financially. So each new neighbourhood starts with input, a small pot input, something like £5,000. But from there on in, we hand the ownership over to the neighbourhood. So from there on in, they make the financial decisions too. And when they run a street project, there's almost always a surplus, and that gets handed in gift over to the next street to kickstart their initiatives. So that community, then we help them apply for smaller local community pots, because after all, how expensive is it to sit around the table packing seeds? How expensive is it to go for a walk with your neighbours? Holding events can get slightly more expensive, creating things can get slightly more expensive, but it's all within the power of these individuals to apply for the funding that they need themselves. And then it goes around and around inside each of these squillimeters, we call them, it just means a neighbourhood, 1 square kilometre approximately. With terrors for making up words for things. But we found that we had to make up a new language, and we had to adopt a new economy to even do this work, to remove the power from the top-down approaches. Because if you accept funding, you accept a whole set of conditions as well. And I'm sure that's something that everyone here is familiar with. But if you just accept funding to kickstart, put that into the community and hand it to them, then the rest can happen in gift, which is a transformative thing. Lewis Hyde told us this back in the 80s. He wrote a transformative text on that. And it can happen through gift and circular economy. So yeah, our answer has been to adopt, to marry new approaches with new economy.
Cara, do you have anything to add on from your experiences?
As a freelancer, the most interesting project that I was brought into was a project that I've been working on quite closely for the past 10 years, where actually it wasn't the funder, it was a group of women from an area of deprivation in Fife that were fed up with the way that the local authority was disrespecting their needs as tenants of their council accommodation. And they fundraised a bit of money to bring me in as a theatre maker so their voices could be heard in another way, because their letters weren't working, their phone calls weren't working. They weren't being able to be in a position to speak directly to, I suppose, the gatekeepers of the housing associations, despite their best efforts. So they raised a bit of money to bring me in, and we used that as a I suppose, a catalyst to get, just like Jojo explained, more money from other organisations, because once you had that little pot of money, it bred other money. And through that, these women then, I suppose, they took ownership over that situation. And just to sort of move this conversation forward a little bit with regards to sort of funding, these women put on a performance, because in Scotland, if you live in council accommodation, you have 30 days to pay your rent, and if you don't pay your rent, you go in arrears, and if you're in arrears twice, then you could be, I suppose, moved out of your accommodation and sometimes be made homeless. So these women who are living in the most horrendous situations, who had damp, who had asbestos in their homes, who had cracks in their windows, all of which the council were responsible for fixing, because that was a part of the tenancy agreement, gave the council 30 days to fix these things, and if they didn't, they were going to escalate it up the tree. And every time they escalated the conversation up the tree through performance, they generated more money from different funders to help move them forward. And the end result was that these women who lived in the most horrendous situations took their performance to Scottish Government, and they all got rehomed as a result of this. Sort of 6 women who lived in this accommodation, and actually what happened is it became a catalyst for their whole estate, which wasn't supposed to get torn down for another 5 years. The other housing association who was funding this new build really heard what they were saying. So there's just something about being with people to have the confidence, as Jojo so eloquently articulated, to move themselves forwards. And if you're lucky enough to be part of that journey and to listen and learn from people, you can actually use that learning yourself.
I kind of want to play the devil's advocate because in the sign-up sheet, there were some people from foundations who were going to come. I'm not sure if they're here in the space, but anyway, it's going to be on our website afterwards, this recording. There is a lot of conversation around a deficit in our imagination, an imagination crisis that Jeff Morgan terms in his new book, Another World is Possible in the Social Innovation Space. And we all know that, the arts, I think we've covered quite a lot from different angles through today's presentation, that it could be an inspiration, it could be a trigger, it could be a space for people to critically reflect upon themselves. And it could, there are so many different uses of the arts. But what about sort of like new narrative shifts are often the most difficult to quantify or even maybe qualify in terms of impact, but it doesn't mean that the arts doesn't produce a value or impact. It's just that it's often positive externalities that nobody pays for. And there are, conversations in the social innovation space around social financing and a lot of different ways of doing things. But, we've never really considered what would an impact bond for the arts look like. And also when we want to talk about cross-sector innovation and experimentation, in my experience, I do quite a lot of this work, but it's so difficult to get funding for it because a lot of the funds are very restricted. Applying for an arts funding, right? I'm only going to give you an arts funding if you do something around racism or, like this kind of outputs, which means that your options are already restricted. And if you want the kind of innovation that happens deeply in a cross-sector manner, there are very few grants and funding that are open enough to allow for such innovations to happen. And then this kind of brings in the conversation with philanthropy. You know, what is the role that philanthropy can play to fund more of such experiments? Because if we want to look at the future and if we want to look at change, the fact is that we've been stuck with this climate crisis for years. Why is it that there isn't enough action? You know, why is it that we are facing this this imagination crisis where we are finding it so easy to think about a dystopia, but then we're not finding it easy to think about what is the world that we want to live in? You know, we complain quite a lot and quite easily about what's happening in this world, but then who is imagining what are the spaces we want to go to, and how is it possible to reach that? And by intersecting the different sectors and methodologies and ways of working, we can come up with new ideas and new ways of doing things. But where are the spaces and resources to support that? Change can happen a lot faster and a lot further if we actually open up, you know, resources for this kind of experimentation to happen. So just sort of putting it there. If anyone wants to, you know, switch on your camera and pipe in, please feel free. This is an informal conversation. Would be lovely to see your faces.
We still have lots of questions in the chat as well, if you want to go to those.
I see one question by Sonia. So Sonia's question, what are some of the challenges in connecting or collaborating with communities? Anyone wants to take that question? I think, okay, maybe I can just kick it off. In terms of challenges connecting or collaborating with communities, I find when working with youth, okay, but the background is that I work quite internationally, so I have not been based at a place for that long. When I was back in Singapore during COVID, it was like I did a project called Ladies' Night, Our Time to Talk. It was a forum theatre project with women to talk about issues, and it was quite an intergenerational group, but we were also trying to reach young people. And I think the thing is also that it's not that easy to reach young people all the time, as much as, you know, I want them to be involved in projects, and I feel like, you know, youth are the group that is kind of underserved and needs more support with like climate pessimism and all of these different issues. It's not that easy to find young participants, especially in Singapore context where education is very important and prioritized. So people are going for tuition even outside of their school curriculum, and there are not that many free spaces and time for young people to engage. So I think like some of the issues of like participants engagement would be sort of around that. It's very context specific as well, depending on who you work with. Sometimes it's easier when you work with nonprofits or NGOs. Like when I was working in France with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, they were working with minors who were seeking asylum. So it was easy from then to work with the boys. And I think one thing was also that something I learned from the process was, instead of going in as an artist, like, okay, this is what we're gonna do, I just went in and got to know who they are and made friends and, you know, connected with them. And then, you know, what are you interested in? If it's a ball game, you know, let's organize something together. And then really finding out what was the best way of engagement with them, instead of going in as like, oh, this is what I'm used to doing, like theater and costume, and this is what I'm gonna do. Like really putting all that aside and listening to your community. I wonder if anyone else wants to.
I can chip in there. I think there are so many, and I think that's something that people who do this work have been honing for, you know, decades. And so it's something that I really think is undervalued by people outside of our sector. Those of us doing it, knowing like instinctually or intuitively all the different considerations, ethically, practically, everything about working with communities. And I think people sometimes go, wouldn't it be nice to involve the community in this, and have no idea what that really means in practice, and about how much you have to shift your wants and needs in favor of others. And so the biggest challenge, I think, if you were brand new to it, would be how many assumptions, even well-meaning assumptions, or sort of hierarchical, powery things we bring in with us about what we want to achieve, especially if you've applied for funding without talking to a community member, right? You come in with a goal, or you come in with ideas about what should happen and how it should happen, and then you've got you know, 60 people in front of you that think totally differently and don't want what you think is a good idea and need something else. And so that's what we sometimes talk about, parachuting into communities. I think Jojo or Clara, you said that right, and the issues with that. The other one that I think crops up when you're maybe a bit further down the line with it, so that ethical stuff is right at the beginning, confronts you immediately. But then when you're further in, I think you start to notice who's in the room and who isn't in the room, and who comes to community discussions and who doesn't, who's given up long since, or who is at home with the kids and doesn't have childcare, or, you know, who has all these reasons as to why they couldn't come to that workshop that you ran. And so you have then a decision about whose voices are involved in that project and whose voices aren't, and who starts to be representative of a community and whose voice then becomes absent from the community. And so there's all sorts of practical things, but I think those are two really big ones in working with community that see time and time again when you first approach the work.
Can I just expand on that brilliant point that Madeleine's made about sort of knowing who and who isn't there? And I think it's about the consideration of, when you're having these community projects, how you make it possible for people to be there. Do you have transportation? Do you have a creche? If you're working with young people, when you think about Maslow's hierarchy of need, like, what was their living circumstance the night before? Are they homeless? Were they warm? Were they fed? Are they in the right mindset to be there? And that's when exactly what Fié said, that is absolutely about starting from the position of where the person is at and not coming in with your artistic agenda. Yes, as an artist, that is our skill base, but we're not using our art to tell our version of that person's lived experience. We're using our skill base to share that skill base so other people can tell their experience of that lived experience. And when it comes to that intersection of speaking to other people, to get other funders involved, this is where, unfortunately, we have to go back to the old school notion of show business. It is a business. You have to understand business models. You have to be able not just to use qualitative data, you need to use quantitative data, because people buy into that, people buy into the science. And if you can prove shifts, as well as lovely quotes from people, if you can show how people have these changes, then that's what people will fund you again, because that's all. A lot of the time, some of these funders are interested. Oh, we've increased people's confidence by 25%. Aren't we great? Yeah. But actually, rather than just tell me that in an email, come and speak to these people firsthand and listen to their experiences. And that's where we have the opportunity as, and I'm using the word change makers loosely here, because like I said before, I firmly believe that people have their own resources to do that. But what we have the capacity to do is have the conversation with people, to bring people into the room, to see these people firsthand, who then collaborate with people. And if we can do anything when we leave, when we have, I hate the word parachuted in, but when we exit a community, we have built that network, we've built that conversation, we've built that trust. But unfortunately, a lot of that comes down to the fact that we have to be excellent facilitators, starting from where people are at and understanding business models of how to talk to another set of funders. And by doing that, hopefully, that's where that ladder of participation come in, that people become more confident in sharing their lived experience, and people are more confident to leave their offices and talk to people firsthand.
Sonia, did you want to add on? I see that you've got your camera on, so nice to see your face.
I did, yeah. So I'm Sonia from the Tamarack Institute. Nice to meet everybody. I'm the Director of Community Innovation. So we do so much work in community engagement, and as a kind of artist background, I kind of have my foot in both the worlds. So this has been such a fascinating conversation. So thank you, everybody. And it's interesting for me, coming from like the community engagement side, or working with communities, municipalities, foundations, and people that are, you know, or organizations that are trying to connect. And that there seems to be this gap or this need. So it's interesting now to hear from the artist perspective, which is why I wanted to further understand it. Because I think people want to engage artists, but as we've kind of discussed or touched on earlier on in the conversation, it's kind of like an add-on, you know, and then people are expecting an artistic outcome. You know, is it going to be a mural? Is it going to be something that's physical or seen in the visual arts or theater or whatnot? So I think it's really interesting of how we can collectively move the value into the artistic process, and how do we quantify or show to funders, or mostly funders in this case, the value of that process, and how that process is the magic that connects people to ideas, that connects communities, that is the kind of the thing that ignites the commitment to a particular outcome. So I just wanted to add that it's interesting, and my wheels are turning of how we can better close that gap and connect. Because I know there's also a lot of artists that are, that want to get engaged, or maybe just, unless you have that network developed, you might not know how to access, being that creative force, or providing those creative processes and methodologies to a group that's eager to find different solutions. That's all.
Thank you. I kind of just want to sort of wrap this up, and also share some of my points. Why I decided to organize this session was also because I saw a lot of interconnections between the social innovation sector and also the arts. And there are social innovators that are doing a lot of work, be it with public policy sector, municipalities wanting to engage with local communities, but local communities could be hesitant or kind of cautious against these different organizations that want to come in to work with them. And I think the artists do have a role that you can play to facilitate and open up these spaces as a sort of neutral party, coming in and understanding both sides and trying to work something out together. And the social innovation field is a lot more mature in terms of funding and so many different aspects, like political advocacy wise. Even in Europe, it went on for the good last decade. So it's on a priority of European Commission's agenda, funding agenda. And this is something that the arts is not there yet. And I think what are some of the gaps is also that artists are not that great in impact evaluation, because we don't think that way. Honestly, a lot of artists struggle with that, but this is something that needs to be done. How could we work on creating more impact resources, which I know a lot of our Canadian colleagues have been doing really well. I've been seeing these different resources, and Canada is also quite developed in the community, social innovation and participatory art aspect. So how could we work together on developing such resources? Second is how do we increase these conversations with funders? This also means community organizations, social innovation sectors that already have these relationships with foundations and funders. How could you bring in artists to have a more in-depth conversation, to share a different perspective? I put myself in very different spaces, like in the social innovation space, social entrepreneurship space. Honestly, it's too much for one person to learn everything. I'm doing my comms, and I'm doing everything a network needs to be done. I'm doing what an artist needs to do, and then having to figure out the business model. It's too much on one person. And if we could cross-sector, work together, collaborate, it reduces the responsibility on each person, and we get to impact faster, because it's going to take me so much more time to develop a business development model than to actually do the work itself. So how could we leverage on what each other does best and move forward together? That's another point. And bringing artists into the conversations, not in a pacifying manner, as oh, you're just going to create some music and entertain us for an opening, but really how do you create the right spaces for artists to be able to speak up and share? So I'm in a social innovation space now. A lot of times I don't know if I should talk or not, because the space is not used to me, and it's not used to my processes. And when I say something, people don't necessarily understand it. And that's the thing about cross-sector work, because there is a lot of language and vocabulary bridging. When I did the project with sustainable enterprises, they were talking about very business terms. They were talking about very scientific research terms, and they didn't understand the artistic terms. And it was a lot of bridging, which, it's not just about having the translator come in to do the bridging. It's also about individuals, practitioners in the different sectors learning and building up capacity for understanding what the other sector means. And that's about learning communication. So there is a lot more work that we can do. Social Innovation Connect here, our project that is funded by European Commission for these 2 years, it's meant to be the sort of competence center UK. Our base would be more like Glasgow and London. And this is a conversation that I would love to continue. If people in this group are keen to continue this conversation, feel free to connect with me. I will leave my email. we have to, because we're sort of running over. If anyone has any last thoughts, please feel free to unmute and share, and I will leave my contact.
I'd just like to say thank you so much, Fié. I'm constantly in awe of you and your work and your energy to build these international connections. I just feel so privileged to be part of it. And Clara and Madeleine, I'm just completely blown away. I feel not alone. I feel connected, and I feel that there was a common message in language that from 3 very different perspectives came out. I hope you do too in the talk. I'd love to speak more with you both.
Yeah, get in touch, Jojo. I'd love to speak further with you.
Wonderful.
Me too. Thank you for having us. Thank you for listening. And I hope that all of you, if you're not already in teaching artistry, have started to turn the wheels about where it might be useful in your own social goals, your own life, and your own community. So thank you.
Thank you everyone for taking time to join us. If you go through the podcast and there's anyone you want to connect with, just send me an email. I'm happy to connect you. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, see how you could work together, I'm the point of contact. So just send me an email at fié@socialinnovationexchange.org. Thank you so much. Have a great, lovely rest of the day and rest of the week. And I will send like post events, the slides, the chat, etc. in an email to everyone.
Thanks, Fié. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.